Despite working closely with one another on multiple high-stakes occasions, Walt and Mike never seemed like they were entirely on the same page. On the surface, they seemed to share at least some similarities. They both have people that they needed to provide for, and they would put a lot on the line for the sake of their loved ones. Even so, Walt and Mike never actually bonded over this fact, or even anything at all, for that matter. Throughout their entire time working together, the two did not interact much. Their alliance was filled with friction and always felt uneasy. The interactions they did have simply make it seem like Mike did not like Walt very much. Did Mike hate Walt? If so, why? In this video, we are going to take a look at the depths in which both characters are presented and elaborate on how they are actually two sides of the same coin. On the surface, Mike and Walt were quite similar. They were both in the crime business to provide for their family. The crimes that they were committing were simply means to an end, and a noble end at that. This underlying motivation for committing crime became the fundamental driving factor that justified their otherwise morally gray actions. For Mike, he felt responsible for his granddaughter Kaylee and his daughter-in-law Stacy. He blamed himself for the death of his son, or left them without a provider in their family. Therefore, Mike had taken it upon himself to make sure that their financial needs were well taken care of. This was exemplified in Mike's quote to Saul when they were stranded in the desert. Here, Mike described how he had people waiting for him at home, and how he would stop at nothing to ensure that they were well taken care of. He did all this so that when it was time for him to die, he would leave knowing he did everything he could to provide for his people. This quote by Mike seemed like it was aggressively reinforced by Walter. Throughout his journey, Walter always made sure that everyone around him, but mostly him, knew that he was in fact doing it not for himself, but for his family. Starting from his cancer diagnosis, Walt opted into a life of crime. We are led to believe that his concern over the fact that he wouldn't be able to leave much for his family made him consider doing something radical. Walt couldn't bear the thought that he would die leaving nothing for his wife and son. Walt felt like he lacked the competence of a provider. Near what Walt perceived to be the end of his life, he had done nothing notable to his family. He felt like his part-time job at the car wash and his day job as a teacher were not enough. This, coupled with the fact he felt like he had $1 million business taken away from him, left him feeling like he was nothing more than a failure. Like Mike, Walt wanted to die knowing that his family did not have anything to worry about their financial needs. Both characters thus have explicitly expressed on more than one occasion that their family always comes first. This baseline similarity becomes the basis from which the parallel between the two is drawn. Strangely enough, it also becomes the point through which their differences sprout and are reinforced. While both were seemingly driven by the same kind of motivation, the truth was quite the opposite. It was true that Mike was doing it for the sake of his family. However, the same couldn't be said about Walt. If Mike had a surefire way of securing an adequate amount of capital to last Kaylee and Stacy's entire lives that didn't involve something as risky as drug dealing and assassination, Mike would do it in a heartbeat. He stayed in the game because crime pays. Mike didn't see himself as a hero or a saint. He knew he was a criminal, and he didn't pretend like he was better than he was. Mike's plan of action was always to show up, do what he had to do, make sure he was compensated properly, and leave to do it again the next day. Mike understood that he was a killer who had done terrible things to various people, so he never elevated himself above it. Mike did not justify his actions. This was where Walt differed. Walt was more concerned about how he was perceived by society and the sense of power that he was able to get from indulging in his meth cooking business. Walt was offered early in the series to have his hospital bills paid for by his old business partners. Walt's rejection of this proposal marked the departure point within his shared philosophy with Mike. Although Walt kept justifying everything he did as something that was done for the sake of his family, Walt knew that it had always been about him all along. It was true that Walt wanted to provide for his family, but Walt only saw his family as an extension of himself. They were his property, and as soon as someone else provided for them, Walt would feel like something precious to him was taken away violently. For Walt, it was about the sense of power and control he was able to garner by making large amounts of money for his family, all through his own singular effort. Walt constantly maintained this awareness in his head. This notion became Walt's anchor to lift himself above the rest of what he saw to be low-life criminals. The parallel between the two are most clear during the moment both decide to get back into business, despite having the green light to go out and escape with a portion of the spoils. Two key scenes further proved and expressed the Walter-Mike dichotomy. The first one was when Mike accepted Walt's request to join his newly operational drug empire, even after having given enough money to save his family. Here, Mike rejoined the crime world because Mike wanted to make sure that all of Gus's, and by extension his employees, were provided for even after Gus died. It was obvious to see that Mike did not necessarily want to do it, but the situation compelled him to. Walter was the exact opposite. The reason Walt got back into the world of crime was because he entertained the possibility of being replaced by Jesse. This notion hurt poor Walt's ego. He decided that despite his deteriorating marriage and adequate amount of money in his possession, he needed to acquire bigger and better deals in his drug dealing. This ego-driven reasoning was what ended up slowly peeling back the layers of Walt's self-delusion. Eventually, he himself had to acknowledge that he had been lying to himself all along. From the beginning, Walt did it because he needed to feel like he was competent. He needed to feel powerful. The culmination of their parallels was their last exchange with one another. Mike made clear of his disdain for Walter, telling him that he ruined the stable system they had, all because he couldn't keep his need for power in check. The passion which Mike spoke with was of note. Mike was a calm character. The elevation of his energy here seemed to signify that maybe the audience wasn't the only one seeing the blatant similarities and differences between the two of them. Mike saw through the delusion and manipulation that Walt was constantly under. Mike saw Walt for what he truly was, a prideful, ambition-obsessed man that lusted over glory and power under the guise of a desperate, cancer-ridden family man. To Mike, Walt was little more than trouble. He was intelligent, yes, but also volatile. This came into contrast with Mike's own slow and steady approach. Mike saw in Walt what he could have been were he to refuse to be honest with himself. Mike was whom Walter would have been if his intentions for his family were genuine. The two simply did not work well with each other. They were too different and yet similar. Despite not wanting anything to do with Walter, Mike eventually stopped containing his anger. After experiencing so much of what Walt put him through, Mike had to express his peace and let Walt know what a liability he was. Little did Mike know that this was ultimately the insult that would cost him his life. Mike's character provided an interesting spin in relation to Walt's. The surface-level similarities they shared were overshadowed by an abundance of clashing values that fundamentally put them at odds with one another. Mike knew he was a criminal, but he also knew that the fact that he was doing it for his family was not an excuse for the terrible things he did. Walt was also a criminal, but there wasn't a single trick of mental gymnastics Walt would not employ to feel like he was simply a competent provider that would go to any lengths to ensure his family's financial stability. Had Walt been more honest, he could have turned up like Mike. However, his attachment to his ego and pride prevented him from ever committing to going down that road.